Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 28th of May, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. According to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are planning in the near future, or the process of deploying a 300,000-strong group has already begun on the northern side, in the northern part of Ukraine. That is, along the Bryansk, possibly Kursk region, perhaps even on the territory of the Republic of Belarus. At the moment, according to him, let's say that 500,000 Russian soldiers, 500,000, are involved in the zone of a special military operation. In other words, we understand the comparability of the figures, and that Russia is going to deploy 300,000 people in some possible potential direction. This is a fairly large grouping. This is 80% obtained from the group that is currently in general on the territory. In other words, it is quite large, and if we compare the territories that are controlled with you, then, of course, we can very well imagine with you, including what territories the 300,000 group is able to hold. If we talk about geolocation, there is very little geolocation of the north. There are several strikes by Russian units with lancets. Here are approximately good shots in terms of good quality. Apparently, you have with you the Bogdan self-propelled gun of the armed forces of Ukraine, which is aimed at, let's say, the border area, and strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation, but was identified during reconnaissance activities, and was destroyed as a result of a lancet strike. Of course, if we talk about the Kharkiv direction, about the northern direction, about any of the directions, the additional opening of the front line, of course, all this needs to be linked and spoken in combination with those words and those moments that the leadership of the Russian Federation is currently discussing, and, let's say, spreading to the whole world about the legitimacy of the President Zelensky. Today, Vladimir Putin has given out a new batch of some thoughts, but now a large group of experts is working, trying to find every moment, every detail, how to find fault in fact, and how to find an excuse to, let's say, not hold talks directly with Zelensky, or postpone this issue, or even force Western partners to put pressure onto Ukraine for the purpose of holding elections. Obviously, all the questions about Zelensky's legitimacy are not aimed at, let's say, I don't know, making elections in Ukraine and either forcing them to hold. There is an attempt to impose its will, of course, on the part of the Russian leadership, and, most importantly, to show, as it were, that we have a reason, an objective reason, why we cannot and are not able to hold any negotiations with a person whom we consider illegitimate. According to Putin, to be more precise, according to, let's say, experts who provide him with information in a state of war, in a state of martial law, and in the event of the end of, say, the powers of the President of Ukraine, the power should at least pass into the hands of the Parliament, to be more precise, the Speaker of the Parliament of Ukraine. But we see with you that this is not happening. Zelensky concentrated all power in his hands. And of course, another attempt on the part of the Russian leadership to force banks, these spiders in the bank, to bask among themselves, somehow watch one by one, and, in general, try to sow discord between, let's say, authoritative and people in Ukraine. That is, well, in fact, the top authorities. Well, let's move gradually to the line of combat contact. We will start with you from the Kharkiv direction. More and more often, the western Kharkiv direction sounds in the reports and news feeds, that is. This is the territory that is located between the settlements of Udy, Cossack Lapi, and Zolochiv. That is, the Zolochiv group of troops, according to the flashed summary, still exists somewhere. If we talk about the situation on the ground, there is no progress, mainly only artillery strikes. We see with you that the Russian units lost the moment of surprise, of course, during the first days of the May offensive, when the offensive was conducted in the direction of Leptsov and Volchansk. Now it is no longer possible to conduct such movements again, the transfer of units. Now, if we talk about the western Kharkiv direction, the whole situation has moved exclusively into, let's say, a boring military channel, from the point of view that here we see with you is similar to the picture that we see ourselves in the Yar, somewhere in the Kupisk direction, somewhere in the work area. That is, the work of artillery, the work of drones, leveling the terrain, after which the infantry goes to clear the positions. If we talk about the Liptsi themselves, several geolocations have appeared today, but they do not make any adjustments there. For example, a serious line of contact. The only thing they give us is an understanding of where the line of contact passes. In these frames, for example, we can observe with you Russian drones in a bucket strike at the Afu stronghold along the Glubokaya-Liptsi road. That is, what tells us that this area, this stronghold, is under the control of a unit in Yusav. This is the area. Let's say that in the area of Lukiansky, more precisely Lukiantsov and Gluboko, that is, between the very center. Between the triangle of Liptsi and Lukiansk, the strength of Ukraine is expressed. They publish footage of the discharge of the Spivdren on, let's say, a passenger car of a unit of the Russian army, which also confirms that this forest is under the control of the Russian army. By the way, if we talk about this forest, of course, this is a big, if I may say so, good luck for the Russian units. In fact, now it will be extremely difficult for Ukrainians to knock out Russian units from this forest. This is the most powerful stronghold, which will dig up along and across. And, of course, it will be here that the main defense of the Russian army will rely on this forest, on these tracts, and will be based on it if the Apu attempts a counteroffensive. And it will be very difficult for a Ukrainian unit to dislodge Russian troops from this particular tract. Then we go with you to the fields between Lukantsy and Zeleny. A similar story. There are personnel confirming the full control of this forest belt by the divisions of Ukraine. In these frames, which were published, we can observe with you the evacuation, an attempt to evacuate wounded Ukrainian soldiers. After the next arrival of a FAB or cab, and the evacuation is underway. Well, the evacuation as a whole is completed quite, let's say, successfully. In other words, these shots confirm the full control over this area by the units of Ukraine. Let's say that in these frames, we can observe with you the next arrival in this particular area, most likely. After which the Ukrainians were forced to apply and use the services of, so to speak, evacuation. Then we are moving with you to Volchansk. There is a similar story here, no progress on the ground, but there are a large number of geolocations that confirm the current statuses every day, that in general the front line has stopped changing here. Again, another day, let's say the citadel of Volchanskaya citadel in the center of reports. So far, Russian units are unable to break through the defense in this direction. They are forced to strike at bridges. They are forced to carry blows with sunbursts, FABs, cabs, and multiple launch rocket systems at this citadel. Are not yet able to overcome it. In other words, in fact, we have been observing that for the last week, probably the last 7 days, there have been no changes at all along the front line, say, along Korolenko Street, along Gogol Street, and along Kolokoltsev Street. There were some changes just south of, let's say, the Volchansky District Hospital, and closer to the Volcha River. Today, footage was also published from the Ukrainian units about the evacuation from this area. And this is what confirms that there are even civilians in the northern part, and that gradually these gay citizens are being evacuated to the south. Well, if we talk about South Volchansk, then there is another photo, a picture of fiery anomalies. In general, we see with you approximate zones of the main combat operations, where artillery mainly arrives in both northern Volchansk and Yuzhno Volchansk, and of course several Lancet strikes. Lancets on artillery installations, on multiple launch rocket systems, on engineering vehicles of the armed forces of Ukraine, which are on the southern part. Here on these frames, for example, the destruction of an engineering vehicle, which, according to the author of this video, it seems like they plan to use, perhaps to restore pontoon crossings or pontoon bridges somewhere along the Volchansk River. Wolfish, so that it is possible to transfer it later. Transfer units or evacuate. Of interesting things, it is worth noting that today a small text message was received specifically for Severny Volchansk, according to which, after Russian units destroyed all crossings, all bridges along the Volcha River, information was received that some units, a certain number of Ukrainian soldiers. It is difficult to say what kind of speech, how much is being discussed. Hundreds, 200 or 2 or 3 people, pressed it turns out, to the Volcha River, are surrounded without the possibility of getting out of the encirclement. That is everything. Some kind of small mini-boiler pressed against the shore, but these are just some messages that, perhaps, have no basis, no, let's say. There is no soil. But because it's a key situation, such a situation happens here every day, fighting is being waged to the death. And, of course, we are now watching the rear oppositions with you. Russian drones are constantly working on them. Russian intelligence flies endlessly just to the very, very south, to a depth of several tens of kilometers to the reservoir itself. Mostly it keeps along the forest, trying to track artillery. Do not let the Ukrainians stick their heads out. As soon as something is noticed, it is also tracked immediately. Something starts to arrive, some heavy cap, or some kind of rocket. Then we are moving with you to the North Cup direction. During the day, there were several, let's say, news that Russian units were activated from the Ivanovka-Stepovanovo-Solovka line. A little to the north, that is, attempts are being made to semi-circle, semi-capture the settlement of the north, in order to finally squeeze out the unit in the forest in the future without, let's say, a lot of resistance, respectively. Without their long and big dagger fights. If there is not a large concentration of Russian troops, therefore it is easier to try to squeeze out an even smaller unit of the armed forces with maneuvers, semicircles. Well, in general, this is more or less obtained by the Russian army. Then we are moving with you in the direction of Balogorovka, the Seversk direction, from where the footage has been coming for several days in a row. Then nothing has been published at all on Balogorovka, except for the summary of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. And now, every day, footage of another Russian fighter is published, who sets up another Russian flag somewhere in the ruins of a settlement. What's left of him? But there is definitely no doubt, the settlement is under full control. It is only necessary to understand exactly where the control ends, since for many days in a row, including shots of artillery strikes on positions in the USU along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass-Seversky Donetsk River, have been published, which perhaps confirms that certain heights along the river are still under control in the USU. As for the Seversky Donetsk River, it is already, in my opinion, also for the umpteenth time in a row, 4 days in a row. Here, in my opinion, 5 or 6 times in May, material was published on the website of the Ministry of Defense, and on the main Telegram channel, as well as on the channels of, let's say, the Luhansk Republic and Donetsk, that exercises are constantly being conducted with the personnel of the Russian army in order to overcome, first of all, the creation, the establishment of pontoon crossings, recrossing of the river. Let's say these trainings and exercises take place along the Seversky Donetsk River. In other words, it is very often quite massively published all the time now. You can find a lot of videos, a lot of frames on the web, so it can be assumed that the Russian army is really planning to force something somewhere. Either it will be the Seversky Donetsk River, or it will be a fragment, or it will be a stallion, but in any case, the Russian units are planning to complete something in the near future. Then we go with you to, let's say, the area of the settlement of Disputable. Well, here, to be more precise, we will talk with you about the next settlement located behind the disputed one. This is Ivanodarevka. Very interesting information comes from this direction. Once again, the Ministry of Defense seems to troll everyone a little. There are shots, of course, on the most controversial. The settlement is being cleaned up, or rather what is left of the settlement. We have been saying for the umpteenth time that an offensive operation may begin in the near future, with the aim of finally restoring control. Perhaps it will start in the near future. But if we follow the summary of the Ministry of Defense, today, for the 2nd day in a row, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reports that the unit of the South Group of troops managed to improve the tactical situation, improve the position along the front edge in the direction of the settlement of Ivanodarevka. In other words, a certain offensive is being conducted now, about which practically none of the Telegram channels reports. The existence of such an offensive can be done solely relying on and based on the reports of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. Something like this is going on now. There is an attempt to wedge into the defense between Ivanodarevka. We are a notch and controversial. It is even possible to storm Ivan Darevka as a result of another unexpected attack. And of the important things, it is worth paying attention to the number of losses suffered by Ukrainian units. As a result of clashes with the South group of troops, this is the maximum indicator, in my opinion, of a special military operation at first. We are not talking about the peaks of, let's say, the fighting during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Once a day, these losses were 1,000 plus, sometimes even 2,000 personnel, there firm the AFU during the next offensive. We are talking about now. The situation is now, when systematic work is being carried out, both sides. One side is in deep defense, the other side is trying to attack. So, according to the summary of the Ministry of Defense, the 54th Mechanized Brigade, which in fact is responsible for this direction, together with the 10th Mountain Assault, was defeated in this direction. And the losses of the AFU amounted to over 700 personnel. This is a record in the conditions of a static front, when there is budding, let's say, for a couple of supports, forest belts, and a couple of, let's say, high-rises somewhere on 1 square kilometer. Well, we are watching. If the information is confirmed, that a flurry of updates on the map will begin in the near future. From the Russian units along the Berestov-Ivan Darivka line, the excavation is controversial. I really feel that something will end here in the near future. Then we are moving with you 4 hours yar. Information is being received, and continues to be received, on the confirmation of control by Russian units of the forest belt between the forest, this tract, and the settlement of Kalinovka, and so far no one confirms the further progress of Russian units, but on the whole, it was possible to wedge in here. To wedge into the ranks of the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, cut the grouping into 2 parts, and increase the supply shoulder. And in general, this information was received last night. For sure, the offensive continued today, the jamming also continued, and for several hundred tens of meters there. Russian units reduced the distance to the Seversky-Donetsk-Donbass Canal of that section located northwest of the village of Kalinovka. Well, the fighting is going on for an hour, according to the Eastern clock. No changes. Footage from both sides is published, but most often it's all archival footage. What is happening now in the eastern part is not yet clear. If we talk about the fields between Ivanovo, Kleshivka, Andriivka and Kurdyumovka, then today information was published about, say, the catastrophic state of affairs in the ranks of the 5th Separate Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. She, along with the 81st, Lut, have been responsible for defense since the 80th. The 5th, let's say, is the same Lut. There are also 2 second mechanized, there was a 93, but it was thrown over. Here they are responsible for the defense over this direction. There are still a couple of strong points, but in connection with the beginning of the publication of this information about, say, the loss of combat abilities, it can be assumed that in the near future, as well as the front line will be activated here, and the APU will finally begin to be squeezed out with the direction. Then we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction. Here, as you can see, blue icons are full of color. Some of them talk about APU strikes, others talk about losses among, let's say, APU equipment. And as we see with you, the main concentration now is in the square Sokol, Novopokrovskaya, Novobakhmutovka, Kiratina. All major military operations in the direction are currently being conducted along this line. There are fighting for several settlements, namely Sokol, Novopokrovskaya. This is the first line of defense plus a number of strong points. Russian units are storming, there are constant assault operations, constant access to positions. Basically, the 47th Brigade is responsible for the defense in this direction. It is the basis here, let's say, of the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. Constant strikes are being carried out on Russian units by drones, some evacuations are taking place from their own. On the part of the Russian side, strikes are being carried out on Dutch Upirchiks, on Bradley, who are also constantly scurrying here from east to west and west to east, which is also being destroyed. But if we talk about any progress on the ground, then nothing has been noted in the last 24 hours. In other words, fighting is underway, as if they are simply transferring one-to-one drone. There is an extremely high probability that the main news on promotions will appear within a few hours. Now it's just silence like this, and someone hasn't reached the internet yet, to publish that other information. There are, of course, some news on some small adjustments to small forest belts, but they do not have any significance. They do not affect, and, in general, they cannot change the course of hostilities. Interesting information comes from Nedolev. There were 2 posts about this today. Ukrainian sources confirm that, in fact, the official battle for Karlovka began today. That is, there is a Karlovka. In fact, it is divided into 2 parts. There is a Karlovka located, let's say, on the Russian side of the Damyka beam. Here is a Damyk beam, a small bridge, and here is a small, let's say, country village. This is the same Karlovka, and this is, let's say, the Karlovka that most likely Russian units will be able to take control of without serious tension there. Since it will be very difficult here, let's say, to supply this group from the Russian units of mortars, snipers, drones, and the ISU respectively, will try to hold the defense in western Karlovka. Eastern Karlovka is already going. And there was a post today during the day that the offensive from the Russian units began. And it sounded somehow in such a way that we are waiting for today. The Russian side writes today, we are waiting for good news towards the end of the day. It is also possible that closer to night, let's say midnight, information will be received about some kind of progress. Perhaps consolidation on the first streets of Karlovka itself. There is no news on Krasnogorsk-Krovka, silence. Fighting is also underway for the Krasnogorsk citadel. Let me remind you that this is a section of the city with high-rise buildings. Georgievka. There's been no news for 3 weeks now. The last post from this direction, if memory serves me right. We had a lot of flags here. Yes, here is Georgievka, Russian control on the 17th of May. That is, 11 days ago, there was a post that the centralized defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in the settlement of Georgiev-Hapala. Our Russian troops advanced to the western screens, the outskirts, and are clearing the last houses from the units of the heights. That is, here is the 11th of May, the last one. Here is a post on the 11th of May. That is, here is the most extreme post on the 17th of May, and for 11 days absolute silence. In connection with what? What is the reason for this silence is not clear. Either the cleanup is really underway, or, it is regrouping in the forest in Maximilievka. It is not clear at all what. But in any case, we are already approaching the deadline for a 2-week regrouping there, and in any case, in the next few days. We should expect a flurry of news from this direction, including Konstantinovka, Novomikhailovka, the 3rd day without news. Separate shots of applying 1,500 atoms to, let's say, Donetsk mine number 3 are published. At least according to the author of this video. But again, there are no attempts to advance, not to expand the control zone, not to advance to the west in Proskoveka, anywhere. But if we talk about the Staromayorsky harvest, then here, as usual, the fighting is boiling over. The fighting is being conducted in earnest. Here in the area of Staromayorsky, the next shots of another assault attempt were published as part of we already remember that the previous day's Russian units mainly worked in Staromayorsky with the use of motorized infantry units on motorcycles. And she has enough to wedge in deeply, expand the control zone. Then now the old Mayorskaya equipment comes in large numbers. Pay attention, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces of equipment are moving in the direction of Staromayorsky. Then a shot from the Staromayorsky itself, they move further north. This is where the last geolocation was recorded. But again, we see that technology did not stop here, technology moved on. There is an extremely high probability that in the next few days, either the Ministry of Defense, perhaps even tonight by midnight, one of the military officers, for example, publishes a video with frames, with flags and so on and so forth, confirming the full control of Russian units over this locality. The harvest is a similar story. There were also assault operations, also as part of a large number of equipment, personnel from the Russian units. In other words, we can summarize, and we can really come to the conclusion that the battle for the Staromayorskaya harvest has entered its final stage. In the next few days, both settlements will definitely come under the complete indisputable control of the Russian army units. And perhaps Staromayorsko will have to fight for the northern part of it a little earlier for the harvest. But it's only a matter of time. And not months, years, but weeks, maybe days, maybe even hours already. In the central part of the harvest, artillery and aviation strikes were inflicted. And incendiary shells are not inflicted on the frames in order to squeeze out and force the last remaining units of the food to leave the area, and so that they no longer resist. Then we are moving with you to the work direction. It has somehow become active here. This is definitely active, and active not only around the work. Today, the last days, we are getting more and more news from the direction of the triangle. Nestoryanka Novodanilovka Kapani. Here is Kapani, a non-German from this triangle. That's enough to increase the number of updates. There weren't many of them here, but they are all present. That's exactly the processing of the extreme advanced positions in Jesus with the use of flamethrower systems of the sun. Here are some blows. It turns out that the sun strikes somewhere on the very, let's say, lines of combat contact. There are several tens, hundreds of meters from the advanced positions of the Russian army units. Today, Tosami strikes here. That is, processing is underway. Processing of the position of the heights in the fields where the most toss are the most effective type of weapons. We see with you that the toss as a whole reaches, say, the strike distance without any resistance, without exerting any of influence from the side of the USU. Here are more shots of strikes on, let's say, positions. There was an attempt to occupy, apparently by themselves, either rotation, or that the APU drove up to the front at zero. Tried to possibly replace the fighters, but immediately artillery shells began to arrive at them, and, of course, we understand ourselves how this whole story ended. In other words, this triangle is also active, as the Pyatakotki-Lugovoy-Pyatakotki triangle was active in the previous days. In fact, there is no important news on the Kherson direction. Russian units continue to process the Sizo, Cape, Violentayskaya. Intelligence is working on an ongoing basis. Well, of course there are risks, and some kind of anxiety, probably, as if understanding that you don't want to miss any landing. No additional operations there in the bed of the Dnieper River, so the intelligence of the Russian army works around the clock. And in general, of course, if we talk about Russian unmanned aircraft, then all records are being broken here. All imaginable, unthinkable records. Just today, we received very interesting statistical information that the plant for the production of drones in Tatarstan plans to bring production capacity to 6,000 drones per year. Yes, this is Alabuga, here is the satellite footage. But if we talk, let's say, and this plan was the plan for this year to produce 6,000 drones. A year including reconnaissance drones. Just imagine the figure, 6,000 drones. But let's say there is also information that so far at the end of April, the plan has already been completed. For 4,500 drones. That is, if we of course extend with this such a mathematical series as in this case, then we will get ourselves twice as much as, planned. That is, 12,000 Russian industry will be released quietly, only at one factory, for the production of this type of weapons. If we talk about Ukraine itself, today there is information that the French have begun to disown information on the deployment of units. At least that's not all ready yet. Not everything is ready yet. There is still a lot to do. For example, the Ukrainian Ukrenergo reported that the production of thermal energy has decreased to 5%. All thermal power plants have either been destroyed or damaged and are unable to operate at full capacity. The Swedes are also reported today that they have revised their plans to supply their own, let's say, attack aircraft to Ukraine with their own aircraft. But this is due to the fact that in the near future it is possible to deliver the arrival of the 1st and the 16th to the territory of Ukraine. And of course, various political news that, in general,